lot of times, when we're faced with fear, we think the solution is putting our faith in a desired outcome. Like, if we just hope for the best, everything will work out, right? But here's the thing, that's a pretty dangerous way to approach fear. What happens if things don't turn out the way we expect? That fear can come right back. Instead, let's shift the focus. The real way to deal with fear is to place our faith in God, who has control over everything. It's not about the outcome we want, but about trusting that He's got us. No matter what happens, when we think about the Apostle Paul, it's easy to get caught up in how extraordinary he was. He wrote most of the New Testament, performed miracles, and established churches all over the ancient world. He's definitely one of the giants of the Christian faith. But sometimes, I think we forget that even Paul had his struggles. And not just the typical struggles we think of, no. Paul had some real, raw human battles on the inside and out. Let's take a look at what he went through while he was in Macedonia. Paul talks about it in his letter to the Corinthians, and it's a glimpse into a side of him we might not always consider. He was going through some heavy stuff, both physically and emotionally. In 2 Corinthians 7:5, Paul opens up about his experience in Macedonia. He writes, "For indeed, when we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest. We were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears." Did you catch that? Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. That's Paul, the guy who's preaching to thousands, healing the sick, and seeing God move in powerful ways. And yet, he's admitting that he had conflicts with people on the outside, and he had fears on the inside. Now, that's something I think we can all relate to. Because, let's face it, we all deal with conflicts in life, whether it's with family, friends, co-workers, or even strangers. There's always some kind of struggle happening around us. And then, on top of that, we also deal with fears. Fears that sometimes we don't even want to admit to ourselves, let alone anyone else. Fear about the future, fear about our health, fear about relationships, fear about not measuring up. We all know what it's like to be scared. But here's the thing about Paul. He didn't shy away from admitting his struggles. He didn't pretend to be some spiritual superhero who had it all together. He didn't say, "Oh, I'm good, I've got faith, and everything's fine." No, Paul was honest. He was transparent. He told the Corinthians, and by extension, all of us, that he was facing conflicts and fears, and that was okay. Why? Because, as we're about to see, God met him right in the middle of those struggles. Let's dig deeper into what Paul was really going through. First, the conflicts on the outside. Paul wasn't just getting into debates or having minor disagreements with people. He was facing real hostility. He was out there, spreading the message of Jesus, and that wasn't always well received. People didn't just ignore him, they opposed him, they attacked him, and in some cases, they physically harmed him. You have to understand the context here. Paul was in Macedonia, a region where he faced direct personal attacks for preaching the gospel. In that time and place, people didn't just disagree with you. If they didn't like what you were saying, they didn't hesitate to throw stones, beat you up, or throw you in jail. Paul wasn't the kind of guy who shied away from conflict. He knew what he was up against. He had faced many challenges in his life, but he still kept pushing forward. In his letter, he says that when he came to Macedonia, his body had no rest. He was physically exhausted. He wasn't just tired because of the journey. He was tired from the constant battles he was facing on every side, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. He was being attacked by people who didn't like the message he was sharing. They didn't like the fact that Paul was preaching about a crucified Savior who had come to forgive sins. That kind of message ruffled a lot of feathers, especially among the religious leaders and political authorities. And yet, despite all these conflicts, Paul didn't give up. He didn't quit, and that's where his true strength lies. It wasn't in his own ability or strength, it was in his unwavering trust in God. Paul knew that no matter what happened, no matter how much opposition he faced, God had his back, and that's the attitude we need to adopt too. When we face conflicts in our own lives, whether it's a difficult relationship, a challenging work situation, or opposition from others, we can't just focus on the conflict itself. We need to focus on the bigger picture. We need to remember that God is in control, even when things seem out of control. But Paul's struggles weren't just external. He also admits that he had fears on the inside. And I think this is where a lot of us can relate to him on a deeper level. Because, let's be honest, no matter how strong or faithful we are, fear is something we all deal with. Paul was no exception. He faced fears that he couldn't shake, and I love that he's open about this. It makes him so much more relatable. It's easy to put Paul on a pedestal and think, well, he was so great, there's no way he had fears like I do. But the truth is, Paul had fears just like we do, and he admits it. He was troubled not just by the conflicts around him, but also by the fears within him. What were those fears? Well, Paul doesn't give us all the details, but we can imagine. Maybe he feared for his life, knowing that at any moment he could be arrested, beaten, or killed for his faith. Maybe he feared for the churches he had planted, wondering if they would stay strong in the face of persecution. Maybe he feared that he wasn't doing enough or that his efforts were in vain. Whatever it was, Paul had fears, and that's okay. It doesn't make him any less of a man of faith. In fact, it makes his faith even more impressive. Because here's the thing, Paul didn't let his fears control him. He didn't let them paralyze him. Even though he had these fears on the inside, he didn't let them dictate his actions. He didn't let fear keep him from doing what God had called him to do. Instead, he kept moving forward, trusting that God would handle the fears. That's what real faith looks like. It's not the absence of fear, but the courage to keep going despite it. It's about saying, I'm scared, but I'm going to trust God anyway. And that's the kind of faith we all need. When we read about Paul's struggles, it's easy to think that he had it all together, that he never struggled with fear or conflict. But when we really take a closer look, we see the human side of Paul. We see that even though he was a giant of the faith, he was still just a man who dealt with the same kinds of struggles we deal with today. And that's what makes his story so powerful. It's not that he was perfect, it's that he kept trusting God, even when things were tough, even when he had conflicts on the outside and fears on the inside. Paul chose to trust God. And that's the kind of faith that we should strive for. So, next time you're facing conflicts or dealing with fears, remember Paul's example. It's okay to have fears. It's okay to struggle. But just like Paul, we need to keep moving forward, trusting that God is in control. He's got us in the palm of his hand, no matter what. And if God can use Paul, who was just like us, he can use us too. So don't let the fears or the conflict stop you from stepping into the purpose God has for you. Like Paul, you've got this. With God's help. Paul's journey in Macedonia was far from easy. In fact, it was filled with physical hardships and external conflicts that would have broken many people, but not Paul. His story is one of incredible perseverance, even in the face of fierce opposition. He knew that his mission, spreading the message of Christ, was crucial, and he wasn't going to let anything get in the way of that. Now, to understand the weight of Paul's struggles, it's important to take a look at the historical context. Paul was traveling through Macedonia during a time when the Roman Empire ruled much of the known world. Macedonia was a region in northern Greece, and it was a place where the early church faced significant challenges. The Roman Empire was not exactly friendly to the message Paul was preaching, and that made life difficult for those spreading the gospel. Macedonia itself was a strategic location in the Roman Empire. It was a province that linked the eastern and western parts of the empire. It had a history of conquest, and the people there were used to the power struggles of the Roman Empire. Paul was well aware of the tension in the region. He wasn't just passing through a peaceful area. No, he was entering a place where the gospel was a threat to the status quo. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 7:5, when we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest. We were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. When Paul says outside were conflicts, he's talking about the external struggles he faced in his mission. You see, Macedonia wasn't a welcoming place for the message Paul was bringing. In fact, it was the complete opposite. Wherever Paul went, he faced resistance. This wasn't just verbal disagreement, it was outright hostility. He faced physical attacks, verbal abuse, and constant threats. People didn't just dismiss his message, they fought against it. The very message Paul preached, the gospel of Jesus Christ, was viewed as dangerous to the powers that be. It challenged the religious order, it challenged the political order, and it threatened the status quo. That's why Paul faced such fierce opposition. It wasn't just about people not agreeing with his ideas, it was about people feeling threatened by them. And when you challenge the way things have always been, you're bound to make some enemies. And that's exactly what Paul did. Everywhere he went, he encountered hostility. Paul's message wasn't just about preaching some nice moral lessons. It was about proclaiming that Jesus Christ was Lord, that he had died on a cross to save humanity from their sins, and that his resurrection proved that death had been conquered. This was a radical message, one that went against the grain of the Roman Empire's belief system. The empire was built on power, on might, and on control. The idea that a man who was crucified in the most humiliating and painful way could be the savior of the world was absurd to many. And because of that, Paul's message was met with great resistance. But Paul wasn't just facing hostility from the outside. He was also dealing with physical hardships that wore him down. The toll this took on him was immense. The no rest that Paul mentions in his letter wasn't just a result of traveling. It was because he was constantly on the move, constantly dealing with conflicts, constantly facing opposition from people who didn't want to hear what he had to say. In fact, Paul writes about some of these physical hardships in his earlier letters. In 2 Corinthians 6:4-5, he talks about how he endured much patience in tribulations, in needs, in distresses, in stripes, in imprisonments, in tumults, in labors, in sleeplessness, in fastings. What Paul is describing here is a life of relentless suffering. He wasn't just dealing with a little discomfort, he was being beaten, thrown into prison, and constantly on the run from those who wanted to silence him. And yet, through all of this, he never gave up on his mission. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer physical exhaustion Paul must have felt. Traveling from city to city, facing physical violence from those who opposed him, all while trying to spread the message of Christ. And yet, Paul didn't stop, even when his body was physically worn out. When he was weary from the constant conflict, he kept going. His faith was unwavering. The city of Corinth, where Paul had established a church, was also a key part of his mission. Corinth was located in the southern part of Greece, and it was a bustling, cosmopolitan city. It was known for its wealth, its commerce, and its diverse population. But Corinth was also known for its immorality and its idol worship. The people of Corinth were steeped in pagan practices, and Paul's message was a direct challenge to that way of life. Paul had spent a significant amount of time in Corinth, preaching to the people there, establishing a church, and nurturing the believers. But his time in the city wasn't without conflict. The church in Corinth faced its own set of challenges, and Paul had to deal with many issues within the church, including divisions among the believers and the temptation to return to their old ways of living. It was a constant battle to keep the church strong and focused on the gospel. And yet, despite all of the struggles he faced, Paul still had a heart for the believers in Corinth. Even though he was experiencing incredible hardship in Macedonia, he still took the time to write to them, to encourage them, and to check in on how they were doing. But back to Macedonia, when Paul says, outside were conflicts, inside were fears, he's also revealing something about his inner struggle. It wasn't just the physical hardships that were weighing on him, it was the emotional toll that came from the constant rejection and hostility. When you're preaching a message that people don't want to hear, it can be discouraging, and Paul was no stranger to that discouragement. But despite the fear he felt on the inside, he continued to move forward. In fact, it's important to recognize that Paul was fully aware of the dangers he was facing. He wasn't naive. He knew the risks of his mission, but he also knew the importance of what he was doing. He knew that the gospel was the power of God to save lives, to change hearts, and to bring people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's why, despite the physical hardships and the external conflicts, Paul pressed on. He didn't let fear control him. He didn't let the hostility of others stop him from doing what God had called him to do. This is where the true power of Paul's example comes into play. He shows us that even in the face of great adversity, we can choose to keep moving forward. We can choose to persevere, to trust in God, and to continue our mission, no matter what opposition we face. So, when we read about Paul's journey in Macedonia, you It's not just about a man who endured physical hardship. It's about a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the gospel. It's about a man who knew that the message of Christ was worth facing ridicule, worth facing persecution, and even worth facing death. And that's the kind of commitment we're called to today. The hostility Paul faced isn't something that only happened in ancient times. It's still very much a reality today. While we may not face physical violence in the same way Paul did, we still face opposition in various forms. Whether it's at work, in our communities, or even from family and friends, the message of Christ still challenges people's beliefs and their way of life. And that's why, just like Paul, we have to be willing to stand firm in our faith, even when it's hard. Even when the conflicts and the fears seem overwhelming, we can trust that God is with us, just as he was with Paul. Paul's story is a reminder that the road to spreading the gospel is not always smooth. It's often filled with conflict, with hardship, and with opposition, but it's also filled with purpose, with power, and with the presence of God. So as we reflect on Paul's experience in Macedonia, let's remember his courage, his perseverance, and his unwavering commitment to the mission God had given him. And let that inspire us to continue on in our own journey, no matter what challenges we face along the way. When Paul went out into the world to spread the message of Jesus, he quickly realized that people didn't respond to the truth the same way. In fact, he encountered 3 very different reactions, and these reactions weren't just limited to his time, they're still present today. People's responses to truth, especially the truth of the gospel, are often a mix of humility, apathy, or hostility. And understanding these reactions can give us a clearer picture of how we navigate sharing our faith in the world. First, let's talk about humility. This is the reaction that Paul was hoping for when he preached. Humility is when a person hears the truth, recognizes its weight, and responds with a willing heart. They understand their need for a savior, acknowledge their sin, and are ready to change. This is the ideal response. When Paul preached about Jesus, some people heard the truth, and it broke them. They realized that they weren't perfect and needed forgiveness. Their hearts were soft, and they humbly accepted the message. This was actually the response Paul encountered in some of the places he visited. In Acts 16, we see a story about a woman named Lydia, who was a seller of purple cloth in the city of Philippi. When Paul and his companions arrived there and shared the gospel, Lydia's heart was opened. She listened, believed, and then was baptized. That's a beautiful picture of humility in action. Lydia didn't argue. She didn't dismiss Paul's words. She didn't get defensive. She heard the truth, recognized the truth, and humbled herself to accept it. And in doing so, she became part of the early church that Paul was building. It's not always easy to respond with humility, though. It requires a person to recognize that they are not the center of their own universe, that they don't have all the answers, and that they need help. Humility involves admitting that we don't have everything figured out, that we are not self-sufficient. And when it comes to faith, it means admitting our need for Jesus and his sacrifice for us. It's a heart posture that says, I don't have it all together, but I'm willing to follow the truth wherever it leads. And when someone responds like this to the gospel, it's one of the most beautiful things that can happen. Now, the second reaction Paul often encountered was apathy. Apathy is when someone hears the truth but just doesn't care. They're not hostile toward it, but they're not moved by it either. They just shrug it off as irrelevant. It's nice that you believe that, they might say, but I'm good with where I'm at. This was a response Paul faced in places like Athens, where the people were known for their love of new ideas, but never really committed to anything that would challenge their way of life. In Acts 17, we read about Paul speaking to the people of Athens at the Areopagus, a place where intellectuals would gather to discuss different philosophies. Paul preached to them about the God who made everything and how this God had sent Jesus to bring salvation to humanity. Some of the people listened with curiosity, but they didn't seem to be deeply moved. In verse 32, it says that when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. It's not that they were hostile, they just weren't interested. They were indifferent. Okay, that's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really change anything for me. They weren't actively rejecting the gospel, but they weren't accepting it either. They were indifferent. Apathy is perhaps one of the hardest responses to deal with because it's so passive. It's easy to confront someone who is hostile. At least you know where they stand. But when someone is apathetic, it's like they've put up a wall around their heart and nothing can get through. They might hear the message, they might even respect the person delivering it, but in the end, it's just not something that affects them. They go on living their lives as if the gospel doesn't matter. And today, we still see a lot of people who respond this way to the truth. They hear about Jesus, but they just don't see the need for him. Their lives are fine without him, so they don't bother to listen further. But here's the thing about apathy. While it's hard to break through, it's not permanent. The gospel doesn't lose its power just because someone is indifferent. People who are apathetic today may be open to the truth tomorrow. Sometimes, the seed of the gospel just needs time to take root. We shouldn't give up on those who seem apathetic. Instead, we should continue to pray, continue to share the message, and trust that God can work in their hearts in his time. The final reaction Paul faced was hostility. This is when people hear the truth and actively oppose it. They don't just reject the message, they resist it, they mock it, they fight against it. Paul experienced hostility from various groups throughout his ministry. In Acts 13, for example, Paul and Barnabas were preaching in Antioch, and many people were interested in what they had to say. But there were also some Jewish leaders who were jealous of their success and stirred up opposition against them. In verse 50 it says, "But the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city, and they stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their district." This wasn't just a matter of disagreement. This was an active attempt to silence them. Hostility is perhaps the most intense reaction to truth. It's not a neutral stance. It's a stance that seeks to undermine or destroy the message. People who are hostile to the gospel often feel threatened by it. Maybe it's because they don't want to give up control of their lives. Maybe they don't want to change their behavior or beliefs. Maybe they're angry at God for something that has happened in their lives. Whatever the reason, hostility can be a powerful force. Today, we still see hostility toward the gospel. People aren't just indifferent, they're angry about it. They might call Christians hypocrites or bigots. They might try to shut down public discussions about faith or Christian beliefs. Hostility towards the truth of the gospel can show up in many forms, from verbal attacks to physical persecution. And while this is hard to face, it's also something that Jesus warned us about. He told his followers that they would face persecution, and Paul experienced this firsthand. But here's the thing about hostility. It doesn't change the truth. The gospel remains just as powerful, just as life-changing, no matter how many people oppose it. And the beautiful thing is that even in the face of hostility, the gospel still has the power to transform hearts. Paul himself is a perfect example of this. He was once one of the most hostile people to the message of Jesus, but when he encountered the truth of the gospel, it radically changed his life. So, even though hostility is real and can be painful, we can't forget that the gospel is stronger than any opposition. So, let's take a step back for a moment and think about these three reactions. Humility, apathy, and hostility. They're all responses to the truth, and they're all still happening today. As believers, we need to understand that we're going to face all three of these reactions. Some people will hear the gospel and humbly accept it. Others might not care at all. And some will oppose it outright. Our job isn't to control how people respond. Our job is to faithfully share the message of Jesus. No matter how it's received, we may never know the impact our words have on someone's heart, but we can trust that God is at work. Just like Paul faced opposition, we too will face challenges in sharing our faith. But no matter the response, whether it's humility, apathy, or hostility, we can keep moving forward, knowing that the truth of the gospel is worth sharing, and that God is always at work behind the scenes. When Paul faced hostility, both from individuals and the wider culture, he responded in a way that was radically different from what the world might expect. Instead of retaliation, instead of fighting back with anger or revenge, Paul followed the example of Jesus and chose to forgive. This wasn't just a passive response, it was an active choice to overcome evil with good, to repay evil with kindness. And let me tell you, that's not an easy thing to do, especially when the hostility is personal and severe. Think about Paul's life for a moment. He was beaten, thrown into prison, insulted, and chased out of towns by people who hated the message he was preaching. These weren't just disagreements over theology. Some of the hostility he faced was violent and life-threatening. Yet, time and time again, Paul chose to forgive those who opposed him and continued to preach the gospel despite the rejection. One of the most powerful examples of Paul's response to hostility is found in his letter to the Romans. In Romans 12, Paul writes about how Christians should respond to evil. In verse 17, he says, "Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men." Notice that Paul doesn't say, if someone does something evil to you, make sure they pay for it. Instead, he says to repay no one evil for evil. When someone wrongs us, we are called not to seek revenge, but to do what is right in the eyes of God. Then Paul goes even further in Romans 12:19, where he says, "Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" Paul knew that justice ultimately belongs to God, and it's not our job to take matters into our own hands. God is the one who will right all wrongs in His time. Our responsibility as followers of Christ is to trust God with the situation and to respond with love and kindness, even to those who wrong us. This is a tough teaching to live out, especially when the world around us tells us that we should fight back, that we should protect our rights, and that we should get even when we've been hurt. But Paul was clear, our response to hostility should be different. It should be rooted in the love and forgiveness that Jesus showed us. Jesus, the perfect Son of God, was falsely accused, beaten, and crucified. Yet, when He hung on that cross, He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. Jesus didn't seek revenge. He didn't call down fire from heaven to destroy those who were mocking Him. He chose to forgive. And that's the example that Paul followed. In 1 Peter 3, the Apostle Peter echoes Paul's teaching when he writes about how Christians should respond to insults and persecution. In verse 9, Peter says, "Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing." This is another example of how we are called to respond differently than the world. When people insult us or treat us unfairly, our natural instinct might be to lash out or to defend ourselves. But Peter says that we should bless those who insult us, showing them kindness instead of returning evil for evil. Why is this so important? Well, for one, it sets us apart from the world. When we choose to respond with love and forgiveness instead of retaliation, we are demonstrating the character of Christ. We are showing that our faith isn't just a set of beliefs, but a way of life. The world may tell us to fight back, to stand our ground, and to demand our rights. But as Christians, we are called to live differently. Paul's response to hostility also showed the power of forgiveness to heal and to transform. When Paul was persecuted, he didn't allow bitterness or anger to take root in his heart. He could have easily become resentful, holding grudges against those who were trying to silence him. But instead, he chose to forgive, and by doing so, he allowed God to work in his heart. Forgiveness is powerful because it frees us from the chains of resentment and anger. It allows us to let go of the desire for revenge and to trust God to handle the situation. Paul's example is also an important lesson for us in how we respond to the culture around us. The hostility Paul faced was not just from individuals, but from the broader culture that rejected the message of Jesus. We live in a world today where the message of the gospel is still met with resistance, and at times, outright hostility. We see Christians being persecuted for their faith, and we face challenges in sharing the gospel in a society that often rejects the truth. But here's the thing, just because the world rejects the message doesn't mean we should stop loving those who reject it. In fact, it's all the more reason to keep showing kindness, to keep responding with grace. Our goal is not to win arguments or to prove people wrong. Our goal is to reflect the love of Christ to those around us. By responding with forgiveness and grace, we create opportunities for people to see the love of God in action. We don't know how God might use our kindness to open someone's heart to the gospel. Just like Paul, we may never know the full impact of our actions, but we trust that God is at work. This response of forgiveness isn't always easy. It requires strength, and it requires trust in God's justice. It's natural to want to defend ourselves, to stand up for our rights, and to get even when we've been wronged. But forgiveness is a higher calling. It's the way of Christ, and it's the way that Paul, despite all the hostility he faced, chose to live. He understood that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that, in the end, forgiveness would always be the better choice. As we reflect on Paul's response to hostility, let's remember that we are called to follow his example. We are called to forgive, to bless, and to overcome evil with good. Whether we face hostility from individuals or from the wider culture, we are called to respond in a way that reflects the love and forgiveness of Jesus. And when we do that, we are not only following in the footsteps of Paul, but we are also reflecting the heart of Christ to a world that desperately needs to see it. And when we think about Paul, it's easy to see him as this bold, fearless leader who preached the gospel no matter the cost. But what we often forget is that Paul, just like us, faced internal fears. He wasn't immune to the struggles that many of us face within ourselves. In fact, when he wrote about his own experiences, he admitted to having fears inside. In 2 Corinthians 7:5, he talks about how outside were conflicts, inside were fears. That's a raw and honest confession from a man who had already endured so much for the sake of the gospel. The truth is, fear is a common experience for everyone. We all deal with it, regardless of how strong or brave we may seem on the outside. Fear is something that can grip our hearts and minds, paralyze us, and keep us from moving forward. And it's important to recognize that fear, in and of itself, is not necessarily bad. There are healthy fears that are a part of God's design for our protection. For example, fear of danger can keep us safe from harm. A healthy fear of fire or a fear of driving too fast can prevent us from making reckless decisions. In that sense, fear serves a good purpose. It helps us make wise choices and avoid harm. But then there's another kind of fear, the kind that is born out of anxiety, doubt, and a lack of trust in God. This is the kind of fear that Paul is talking about when he admits to his internal struggles. This is the kind of fear that causes us to worry about things we can't control. It's the fear of what might happen in the future, the fear of failure, or the fear of not measuring up. These are the fears that keep us up at night, that make us question our worth, and that make us feel like we're not enough. And let's be honest, we all have those fears. Even the most confident people experience them. Fear is a natural response to the unknown, to the uncertainties in life. But here's the thing, when we let those fears control us, when we let them dictate our thoughts and actions, they can become sinful. Because at the root of that kind of fear is a lack of trust in God. It's saying, I don't believe God is in control. Or, I don't believe God will take care of me. That's when fear becomes a problem. Because it pushes us away from faith and towards self-reliance. Paul knew this struggle. He faced external conflicts, opposition from enemies, rejection, and even physical violence. But he also dealt with the internal battle of fear. And in the midst of those fears, he had to choose faith over fear. That's the key here. Fear will always be a part of our lives. But the question is, will we let fear control us? Or will we choose to trust God instead? Paul didn't allow his fears to hold him back from his calling. He chose to press on, to continue preaching the gospel, and to keep trusting in God's plan for his life. It's important to recognize that faith and fear cannot operate at the same time. They are opposites. When we choose faith, we are choosing to trust God in spite of our fears. We are saying, I may be afraid, but I believe God is bigger than my fear. This doesn't mean that fear magically disappears. It doesn't mean that we won't ever feel anxious or afraid. But choosing faith means that we are not letting fear control us. We are choosing to move forward with the confidence that God is with us, no matter what we face. So, The next time you find yourself overwhelmed with fear, whether it's fear of the unknown, fear of failure, or fear of rejection, remember that you don't have to face those fears alone. Just like Paul, we are called to choose faith over fear. And when we do that, we can trust that God will give us the strength to overcome whatever comes our way. In the midst of all the struggles Paul faced, his external conflicts, the opposition from others, and the fears that gripped his heart, God sent him a much-needed source of comfort. That source of comfort came in the form of a man named Titus. Titus wasn't just a fellow worker or a companion on Paul's missionary journeys, he was a lifeline. In 2 Corinthians 7:6-7, Paul writes, "Nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus." That verse is so profound because it shows that even for someone like Paul, who had endured so much and had such a strong faith, there were times when he needed comfort. And God provided that comfort through a person. What makes this story even more powerful is that Titus didn't just bring comfort by showing up. No. He also brought with him encouraging news. He shared how the Corinthians had responded to Paul's message, how their hearts were full of love for him, how they had been moved by his teaching. It wasn't just about physical presence, it was the words Titus brought, the reminder that Paul's efforts had not been in vain. Imagine how much that meant to Paul, to know that despite all the trials, there were people who truly appreciated him and were growing in their faith. God often works in this way. He uses people to bring comfort, to remind us that we're not alone in our struggles. Whether it's a friend, a family member, or someone from church, God often sends someone into our lives just when we need them the most. And the beauty of it is that we too can be that source of comfort for others. Just as Titus was a comfort to Paul, we are called to be a comfort to those around us. In times of hardship, fear, or confusion, sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is the simple act of showing up and encouraging them. Think about your own life. Are there people around you who might need the kind of comfort that Titus brought to Paul? Maybe a friend is going through a tough time at work, or a family member is struggling with their health. Maybe someone in your community feels isolated or overwhelmed. You don't have to have all the answers, and you don't need to be a professional counselor. Sometimes all it takes is reaching out and saying, "I'm here for you. I'm praying for you." That small act of kindness, that word of encouragement, can be a powerful reminder to someone that they are not alone in their struggles. I think sometimes we underestimate the power of our presence. We think that in order to help others, we have to solve their problems or give them some great piece of advice. But often, what people really need is simply someone who cares enough to listen and offer a word of encouragement. Titus didn't solve all of Paul's problems. He didn't magically make the conflict go away or take away the fears Paul was facing. But he did something incredibly important. He reminded Paul that God was still at work, that his ministry was having an impact, and that he was not alone. This is the kind of encouragement that God wants us to give to others. We all face times of external conflict and internal fear. But in those times, God often works through people to bring comfort and strength. And just like Titus, we have the opportunity to be used by God in this way. It's not about fixing someone's problems or having all the right answers. It's about being there for them, offering a listening ear, a prayer, and a reminder that God is with them. So, I want to encourage you today to be like Titus. Look around you and find someone who needs encouragement. It might be someone who is facing external struggles, someone battling illness or going through a difficult season at work, or it might be someone who is struggling with fear on the inside, dealing with anxiety or worry about the future. Whatever the situation, take a moment to reach out. Offer your presence, offer your prayers, offer your encouragement, because just like Titus brought comfort to Paul, you can be a source of comfort to someone else. As we do this, we participate in the work that God is doing in the world. We become vessels of His love, His peace, and His encouragement. And just like Paul, we can be reminded that no matter what we face, we are not alone. God uses people to bring His comfort, and we have the privilege of being part of that process. So, let's be a Titus to others and offer the comfort and encouragement that so many need. As we wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect on the powerful message we've explored today, the message of choosing faith over fear. Life is filled with conflicts, both external and internal, and we will all face moments when fear tries to take hold. But just like Paul, we are called to trust God, even when the circumstances seem overwhelming. Our faith in Him doesn't mean the fear will disappear, but it means that we have someone bigger than our fears walking with us every step of the way. In times of conflict, we can choose to rely on God's strength rather than our own. When fear threatens to control us, we can choose to trust that God is in control. And just as God used Titus to bring comfort to Paul, He can use us to bring comfort and encouragement to those around us who are struggling. Whether it's a word of encouragement, a prayer, or simply being present, we all have the opportunity to be a source of comfort in someone's life. So, as we move forward, let's make the choice to walk in faith, to trust God with our conflicts and our fears, and to be a source of comfort for others. And as we do, let's remember that God is faithful to guide us, strengthen us, and use us in ways that we might not even see. If today's message has been meaningful to you, I encourage you to take a moment to like and subscribe. By doing so, you'll stay connected and encouraged as we continue to walk through life's challenges together, seeking God's guidance and sharing His comfort with others.